The discussion around genetically modified organisms and foods that have been modified genetically has been going on for decades, and there are strong viewpoints on both sides of the issue. GMOs, according to their proponents, have the potential to boost crop yields, solve the issue of food security, and lessen the impact that agriculture has on the environment. Nevertheless, the terrible truth regarding genetically modified organisms exposes a more complicated story. There are significant concerns regarding the growing use of genetically modified organisms in our food system. These concerns include the potential health dangers, environmental implications, corporate control, and the socioeconomic impact experienced by farmers. Concerns regarding health and the absence of long-term studies. The uncertainty that surrounds the long-term consequences that genetically modified organisms have on human health is one of the most problematic features of these organisms. On the basis of the evidence that is now available, regulatory authorities such as the FDA and WHO have determined that genetically modified organisms are safe for eating. However, detractors contend that the long-term effects of consuming genetically modified foods have not been adequately examined. The majority of research conducted up to this point has concentrated on short-term outcomes, and there are not many independent long-term studies that have been conducted on the effects of genetically modified organisms on human health. Among the things that cause concern are the risk of allergic reactions, the introduction of novel toxins or genes that are resistant to antibiotics, and the possibility of interactions between genetically modified organisms and human biology that are not yet recognized. In addition, a significant number of genetically modified crops are intentionally bred to be resistant to herbicides such as glyphosate, which results in increasing utilization of these chemicals. According to the findings of certain research, the active component of Roundup, glyphosate, has been associated with a number of health hazards, including cancer, disruption of the endocrine system, and other chronic disorders. The use of foods that were cultivated with a strong reliance on herbicides may bring indirect health concerns, which raises doubts regarding the general safety of farming practices that involve genetically modified organisms, GMOs as a whole. In spite of the fact that regulatory bodies have, for the most part, disregarded these dangers, the argument is still far from being resolved. This is especially true in light of the growing number of lawsuits filed against corporations like Monsanto, which is now controlled by Bayer, as a result of cancer claims associated to glyphosate. The effects on the environment. The promise that genetically modified organisms will lessen the environmental impact of agriculture has been one of the key motivating factors behind their widespread adoption. However, the regrettable reality is that this benefit has not always been realized. The use of chemical herbicides has increased as a result of the proliferation of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, particularly those that have been bred to be resistant to herbicides such as Roundup-ready crops. The evolution of herbicide-resistant superweeds has occurred throughout the course of time as a consequence of this. These superweeds require even more intense chemical treatments, which further exacerbates the impact on the environment. GMOs have contributed to a chemical arms race between farmers and pests that are resistant to pesticides, contrary to what was initially claimed about their ability to reduce the use of pesticides. Furthermore, the monoculture farming practices that are frequently linked with genetically modified crops might result in a reduction in biodiversity. The practice of monoculture farming diminishes the health of the soil, makes ecosystems more susceptible to attack by pests, and weakens their resistance to disruption. Not only does this have an impact on the local fauna, but it also makes issues like soil erosion, the disappearance of pollinators, such bees and butterflies, and the depletion of natural nutrients in the soil more worse. Gene-modified organisms, GMOs, which are frequently cultivated in large-scale industrial farming systems, may therefore contribute to agricultural practices that are not sustainable and that are harmful to the environment. The transfer of genes between genetically modified crops and their wild cousins is another environmental hazard that needs to be addressed. It is possible for genetically modified organisms to cross-pollinate with non-GMO or organic crops, which could result in the contamination of non-GMO kinds. Legal fights have been sparked as a result of this unintended transfer of genetic material, particularly in communities that practice organic farming. This transfer also poses a threat to the preservation of crop diversity and biodiversity in organic farming. The influence of corporations on agricultural producers. One of the most serious concerns regarding genetically modified organisms is the corporate control that they have over the food chain on a worldwide scale. The market for genetically modified organisms, GMO, seeds is dominated by corporations such as Monsanto, Syngenta, and DuPont. Furthermore, the patenting of genetically modified seeds has resulted in an agricultural industry that is extremely consolidated and monopolized. It is illegal for farmers who utilize patented genetically modified organism, GMO, seeds to save or reuse seeds from one year to the next because they are required to comply with stringent licensing agreements. The result of this is that authority has been effectively transferred from small-scale farmers to giant agribusinesses, which has resulted in a loss of autonomy for farmers. Numerous lawsuits have been filed against farmers who are accused of infringing on patents as a result of the usage of patented genetically modified organism (GMO) seeds. These cases are frequently brought about as a result of unintended contamination from nearby GMO crops. Small farmers and organic growers are subjected to a huge burden as a result of these legal disputes, which further solidifies the power of corporations in the agricultural sector. Farmers in many developing nations who were once self-sufficient have discovered that they are now dependent on costly genetically modified organism, GMO, seeds, and the chemical inputs that are connected with them. This has trapped them in a cycle of debt and dependence on giant businesses. Traditional agricultural practices, biodiversity, and the food sovereignty of nations are all at risk as a result of this monopolistic control over seeds. In addition, genetically modified organisms were initially marketed as a potential answer to the problem of growing food production and reducing hunger in the developing countries. Critics, on the other hand, contend that the socioeconomic effects of genetically modified organisms have made existing inequities even worse. The market is dominated by large-scale industrial farms that are able to purchase expensive genetically modified organism (GMO) technologies. On the other hand, smallholder farmers, particularly those in the global south, sometimes struggle to compete. The agricultural model that is driven by corporations has been a contributing factor in the consolidation of land and the marginalization of small-scale farmers, which has resulted in the destruction of rural communities and the subversion of traditional agricultural techniques. Disputes in the economic and trade domains. There have been considerable economic and trade disputes between countries that support genetically modified organisms and those that do not support them as a result of the worldwide trade in genetically modified crops. Due to concerns over the environment and public health, a number of nations within the European Union, for instance, have enacted stringent limits or outright prohibitions on the growing and importing of genetically modified crops. That has resulted in trade disputes with countries that produce genetically modified organisms, such as the United States, Brazil, and Argentina. Some nations have developed different supply chains in order to cater to the markets for genetically modified organisms and non-GMOs as a result of the division that has arisen over the legislation governing GMOs. In addition, the widespread use of a small number of genetically modified crops such as soy, corn, and cotton in agricultural production around the world has resulted in a dearth of crop diversity in international markets. It is possible that this could make the food system more susceptible to the spread of diseases and the failure of crops. Final thoughts. The terrible reality of genetically modified organisms is that despite the fact that they were introduced with the promise of changing agriculture, enhancing food security, and minimizing environmental harm, the reality turns out to be far more complicated. Concerns regarding health, environmental degradation, the control of corporations, and the socioeconomic impact on farmers all raise serious questions about whether or not genetically modified organisms are an ethical or sustainable solution to the problems that they are causing in the agricultural sector around the world. Despite the fact that genetic engineering has the potential to yield benefits, such as the creation of drought-resistant or nutrient-enhanced crops, the current implementation of genetically modified organisms in industrial agriculture highlights the need for more responsible practices, comprehensive research, and regulations that prioritize human health and the environment over the profit of corporations. If you found this video informative, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think.